Very good morning to all of you. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to chair this panel on social movement, following the very inspiring lecture talk of Kamran. Again, we come back to bottom up, not top down, and see what we can learn from social movement. We have two presentations today. The first one is dear established colleague of me is Dr. Khosrokhavar from the University of Paris, Social Sciences, and the title of the presentation is An Overview of Evolution of Social Movement in Iran. Comparing and contrasting three periods in Iranian contemporary history. An Islamic Revolution of 1979, and then the Green Movement and the very latest uprising in the major cities in Iran. And then we have another presentation by Maral Karimi, very promising new generation of social scientists from the Toronto University, published a very interesting book here. I've got the privilege to have a copy. It's called The Iranian Green Movement of 2009. And the title of presentation of Maral is Theorizing Protest Cycles in Iran, a Casual Loop Model. So with all your permission, I would like to ask Professor Khosrokhavar to start his presentation.
Thank you very much indeed. It's due to the fact that what I'm going to tell you is explosive. Before beginning my topic, I would like to introduce two ideas. The first one is based on the relationship between social movements and society as a whole. Usually, sociologists treat social movements as a dependent variable and society as the independent variable. I try to invert it. It's an exercise which might be successful or not, depending on you, depending on your critical views. I try to use social movements as a kind of independent variable and try to read society's evolution, change, and crisis in terms of social movements, in terms of the evolution of social movements. In order to do that, I take three major social movements in Iran. The first one is the 1979 social movement that ended up with the theocratic regime in Iran. The second is the 2009 Green Movement that my colleague will talk about more extensively. And the third one is the scattered movements, between 2016 up to 2018 and 19, and even now. I distinguish between social movements and social non-movements, which is different from what my colleague Asif Bayat has been dealing with in terms of non-social movements. That means those social actions, protests that ended up mainly with the Arab revolutions. What I call social non-movement is, in that respect, totally different, and you'll see it. The first two movements, that means the Iranian Revolution and the Green movements, I call them social movements. And the third one, which is marked by major deficiencies in terms of my definition of social movements, I call it a social non-movement. By social movement, I mean something which is a kind of, I would say, classical definition among most of the sociologists. First of all, a social movement is a social action based on a protest against social domination. Domination by a social class, by the government, by any kind of elite, political or cultural or ethnic and so on. So there is a dimension of protest in the social movement. The second is that social movement has a kind of project of society. This project can be ambivalent, can be more or less explicit, but it exists in some ways. And we'll see that in some of these three social movements that I try to analyze summarily in order to give a kind of picture of the gist of them in terms of my viewpoint. This project of society has dimensions that can be explicitly, discursively debated, and those which are in a way ambivalently treated by social actors. But the project of society, as I said, ambivalent and non-ambivalent at the same time in different directions exist in a social movement. The third one is the fact that social movement is based on what might be called a horizon of hope. A hope that means it can be expressed in terms of the social imaginary and in terms of utopia. So that a social movement, a movement without utopia and the social imaginary and hope, for me is a social non-movement, not a social movement. So that's one of the major characteristics of social movement. The fourth dimension of a social movement is the presence of intellectuals. I distinguish between two types of intellectuals. The one is what I called avant-garde intellectuals. That means those intellectuals which pre-existed the social movement, which have had an influence on the social movement, and which have been prominent in giving the ideological content to the social movement in different ways, sometimes in contradictory ways. And there's another type of intellectual that I call intermediary intellectuals. These are intellectuals that did not pre-exist the social movement. They are produced by the social movement on the spot. That means during the evolution of the social movement itself, they come into being, and the presence is in a way encouraged by new social media, internet and so on. So that they come, they defend, or they reject the social movement within the framework of this sort of virtual public opinion which has an influence on the social movement. And social movements are those movements which have intellectuals, either avant-garde or intermediary or both of them. Now, social non-movements are those which are devoid of, I would say, a project of society or hope and utopia, and second, are devoid of intellectuals. My guess is that it can be debated, of course, that the third movement, that means the scattered movements between 2016 and 2018-19, are devoid of these two dimensions. That's why I call them social non-movements. And in that respect, this concept is, as I said, different from that of my colleague, Asef Bayat, non-social movement, which has its own importance. Now, I try to tackle in perhaps 10 minutes these three social movements and a comparison between them. The first movement, that means the one which ended with the theocratic regime, is based on few characteristics. I try to summarize them in a caricatural way because I cannot have, the time to develop it. But first, it is based on the idea of a heroic individual. This heroic individual is, in a way, expressed through the symbolism of martyrs. what the martyr is and so on, and how it embodies a kind of utopia within the revolutionary Iranian society is something which is, very important, has been dealt with by different, scholars, and it can be, I think, a topic of major interest for all of us. The second point is that in its major tendency, the Iranian revolution was non-democratic and anti-democratic. Heroic, anti-democratic and non-democratic, but certainly not democratic, for many major reasons. There were few Democrats within it, but they were totally marginalized. And the idea of democracy had been, in a way, marginalized and discredited by the failure of the national movement in Iran during Mossadegh, and the way the West, mainly the United States and Great Britain, acted against the first, I would say, proto-democratic movement in the Middle East. So that democracy was not perceived by the social movement, by the Iranian revolution, as being, a kind of defendable idea. And the non-democracy or the anti-democratic tendency was in a way embodied in Islam. Islam in an ambiguous manner. There were two tendencies within Islam in this revolution. One was that epitomized by Shariati's ideology. That means a kind of Islam that had non-class dimensions. As Shariati said, Islam is revolutionary by its essence. Shiism is revolutionary by its essence, does not need any kind of Marxistic ideology, but it was in a way impregnated by Marxism, and particularly by, I would say, communist eschatology. The other side was, of course, the return to a kind of pre-modern society. Some people call it neo-traditional and so on, and it was embodied by Ayatollah Khomeini. So the ambivalence of Islam between these two polarities made it possible to play in an ambiguous, ambivalent manner between these ideologies. And the Iranian revolution was, in a way, I would say, the consequence of the modernization from above by the Shah's regime, who modernized society without taking into account, I would say, its capacity for modernization and its capacity to understand what was going on from above by discrediting what was from below. This was a kind of reaction to that, and of course, the theocratic regime that replaced the imperial regime was by far more repressive and more, I would say, anti-modern in many respects than the Shah's regime. The second movement, the 2009 Green Movement, put into question, first of all, the idea of martyrdom. No reference to martyrdom in the slogans. And there was only one, Hossein, Hossein, and so on, but it was Hossein Mousavi. And in almost all these slogans, and I was there for 3 months, I was in Iran during the social movement, and I could observe the fact that the new generation that took part in the street demonstration were totally different from the generation that made the Iranian Revolution in 1979. So martyrdom had disappeared as a kind of dominant ideology, the idea of an individual citizen became very important. رأی من کجاست؟ رأی من کو? And so on. And there was a kind of capacity for dialogue that was a major innovation within the Iranian society in a massive way. There were always intellectuals in Iran and restricted groups, you know, that were able to understand democracy. But in this movement, for the first time, in a way, I would say democracy was theatralized. It became a kind of social scenery. It was deployed in a way, in a dramatic way, within the streets that became like a theatrical scene. So it was an anthropological, existential way of going towards, I would say, pluralistic society and tolerant society. It became, you know, it happened a year and a half before the Arab revolutions. Although it did not certainly have a kind of direct influence on them, but it had a kind of indirect influence because of its content. I don't have enough time to develop further dimensions of this movement, but we see, for instance, in the street demonstrations that a new kind of relationship, gender relationship, occurs within the Iranian society. Young women and men were able to understand each other in a way which was totally different from that of 1979. There was a kind of idea of fraternity among them. And so one can analyze these street movements in terms of new gender relations as well. A revolution in gender that afterwards was translated into the feminist movement, which is one of the most resilient movements in Iran nowadays, in spite of a harsh repression against its proponents. I go to the third one, and I call it a social non-movement, because within it, we don't have a social utopia. There is a kind of rejection of corruption, of religious duplicity, and of the political elite that is ruling Iran. There is no horizon of hope. It's because those actors who, went to the street were desperate that they did not have anything to propose besides the fact that they wanted a kind of Reza Shah. That means a new type of, a kind of despot which belonged to the past of Iran. And Reza Shah was not only a despot, of course, he created the new, state apparatus. He modernized Iran. He, made a lot. But the new imaginary Reza Shah that was appealing to some of those who took part in the street demonstrations between 2016 and 2019 was a kind of product of their imagination, I would say in rupture with the historical reality of Reza Shah. Reza Shah cannot anymore act within Iran, even if they overthrow the regime, the way he acted, in the 1920s. So that there is my personal statement on this social non-movement is that lack of social imaginary and utopia, lack of the horizon of hope, there's a despair, and lack of intellectuals. The two other movements had intellectuals, either avant-garde or intermediary, or both of them. But the third one has been devoid of intellectuals. And that's why it has been, I would say, repressed very harshly. More than 1,000 people have been killed, many thousands were tortured, and so on. but the movement had no unity. It was based on protest against an intolerable daily life. And daily life becomes very important as a kind of idea I try to defend with my two other colleagues, Saeed Peyvandi and Mohsen Mottaghi, in one article in Persian which was published a few months ago. Daily life becomes very important. Daily life became very important in the Green movement in comparison to the Iranian Revolution, where the heroic individual, sacralized, religiosized, went beyond daily life. In the second movement, the Green movement, daily life, which we call it in French quotidienneté, dailiness, became very important. So the individual citizen in 2009 tried to protest against a daily life which denied him the capacity to be a full-fledged citizen. Daily life in the third movement is, of course, at the origin of this movement, but it is not conceptualized in terms of a horizon of hope, phenomenologically understood, and in terms of social utopia. That's why I call this third movement a social non-movement. And I end up by saying that there is a major point. I think the three social movements let us have a kind of insight into the Iranian society. The first one was against the regime, the Shah's regime, which promoted modernity, but denied political freedom. The 2009 was against a theocratic regime which imposed a kind of religious blindfold on society, and that's why this social movement was deeply secular. I don't say anti-religious, but deeply secular in its content. In the interviews I made during those 3 months in Iran, we see that the social actors who behaved within the social movement had, I would say, a kind of marginalized religious view. So secularization was one of the major topics of 2009. The third one is, of course, secular, because religion is totally rejected by some in terms of political corruption, not in terms of Islam per se, but in terms of political corruption, but has no alternative to the regime, because I say, and it can be put into question, what I say in that respect, because of the lack of alternative in terms of social hope. My guess is that new social movements can bring hope to the Iranian society and put into question in the future the theocracy which has been repressive in its major trends. The last point, only two sentences, I call illegitimate political regimes those which lack the support of the overwhelming majority of the society. My guess is that Iranian regime nowadays is an illegitimate regime. Why it survives? It survives because of the failure of major social movement, and that's the 2009. This failure of the social movement, the repression of those actors, opens up a kind of vista to this type of regime to impose its unpopular, illegitimate rule to society, because we don't have, at this very moment, I would say, social actors that could, new social actors that could promote a new type of social movement that could efficiently put into question this regime. I call this regime an illegitimate political power, and I think it can be extended to many regimes nowadays in the Middle East and North Africa. Algeria, Lebanon, and Egypt at least. So that I propose as a kind of major principle for understanding the continuity and the persistence of these political regimes, the fact that social movements that put into question this type of regime have failed in Iran 2009, in Egypt 2011, January Revolution, and so the new type of regime is more repressive, less popular, and still not contested frontally by society at this moment. I'm personally awaiting a new type of social actor in the new generations that would find the creativity to build up a new type of social movement that would, put into question the regime in a way that has not been predicted by it. That's the only way these types of regimes can be overthrown. A new type of social movement, unpredictable for the regime. Until the moment they are predicted, they can be repressed. Thank you very much.
We leave them in my comments and question and answers to the end. Now we just move to Maral Karimi for her presentation on the title, as I told you, is Theorizing Protest Cycles in Iran, a Casual Link Model.
Can you hear me okay? Okay, so first I have to make a statement about my ripped pants, which apparently are causing a lot of comments. This is a conscious act of subversion. As feminists, we have to disrupt. So here I am. That was also a joke. This is what I'm going to present is my PhD dissertation. I've recently submitted. I haven't defended yet, so be nice. And okay, so I'll start by telling you a little bit about myself because this research is very personal, very emotional for me. In introducing myself, I often say I was born between a revolution and a war, in a war zone, literally in a war zone. So in that sort of being born in that sort of environment and that kind of, was it 0.5% or 1% families that Bazargan was, mentioning? Let's say the 0.5%, growing up in that environment, it molds a young mind. It has a profound impact. And so I literally set out in my life in search for answers. What happened? What's going on? Why am I witnessing so much disappointment, so much hurt, so much loss, so much violence? Some of that violence I'm processing now as an adult. So I tried, believe me, I tried. I went to, engineering school, I dropped out, but eventually this was my calling and I came back to it and I kind of feel at ease at home now what I'm trying to say is I went on a quest to answer questions for myself, to find out what happened, what is going on. Why are we as a nation where we are? So in my first research, my master's research, I did a critical discourse analysis of the leaders of the Green Movement, literally Mousavi, Rahnavard, and Karoubi. And I tried to understand their discourse and the impacts and implications of that discourse on the Green Movement and its failures. And towards the end, when I published this book, I also, the 2018-2019 movements were also happening, so I also added an analysis of those movements in comparison to the Green Movement. So one of the results, one of the conclusions of my first research was These, to many of you, it might be obvious now, but it was a direct result of my research that these movements seems to come in cycles. And these cycles, from where I'm standing, from this research, it doesn't look like they're going to end. So for my PhD dissertation, I decided to kind of look at the pre-2009 movements, the three other major movements in modern Iran, and kind of try to theorize them from a macro perspective. So I looked at the constitutional revolution, the oil nationalization, and the coup, as well as the '79 revolution. I looked at a lot of data. It was very difficult in some instances to collect that data. Some of you were very helpful, thank you so much. And the rest of you, some of you are here. Again, thank you to all of you who helped, and everybody who forgot their email, we blame it on COVID. But it was a collective effort to get that data, especially for the constitutional revolution. So the question that I asked was, so what can successive social movements in Iran tell us, or modern Iran over the past century, tell us about the evolution of the society? Where do we stand as a society? How did we evolve over the past century? And so I asked, to answer that, then I asked a simple question: who are the social movements? Who are the actors in these movements? Which is a question that I had asked before. In the previous research, I had studied the relationship between the agency of the social actors and all the structures they were trying to kind of alter. So I asked that question again: who are these social actors in terms of? But I wanted to study this from the perspective of the subaltern. I know we have we have much scholarship from the perspective of class, the working classes, and what was the role of the various classes in every single one of those movements that I mentioned. But what is missing, I often find missing, or there are silences and absences, is the gender roles. I understand that there's some scholarship on women, but not nearly as much as I would have liked to see. And also the role of ethnics. I wanted to see these social actors, what was their composition in terms of ideology, gender, ethnicity, their geographical proximity to the center, which in some movements become more important than others, and also, of course, social class. So I did that for every single one of those movements. I studied different sets of data, archival data, legal documents such as the Constitution, the supplementary fundamental laws, and for the Constitutional Revolution, various newspapers, memoirs, and for the '79 Revolution, I studied the slogans. And I analyzed them through critical hermeneutics, which is something I had done before. Only this one was a little easier. I'm a critical theorist. I'm firmly grounded in critical theory, and so some of the theories that I drew on were obviously because I wanted to do a historical analysis of these movements. I did some elements of historical materialism. I drew on Parsons. I understand that's a sin, but when it comes to critical theory, but to understand functionalities of different functions in society, I studied Parsons. I drew some of the elements from Parsons' systems theory, Giddens' structuration theory, and of course, in the background, I always have Habermas, one way or another, even though sometimes I don't mention it because, bad Habermas. The concepts of public sphere, social actor, and also the type of critical hermeneutics that I engage in is mostly Habermasian. So the result, like I said, I wanted to theorize and provide a macro vision to understand these political transitions. What do they tell us? And what is the dynamics of the interaction of these forces over the past century? The second question I asked is, what were the demands in each movement? So, the constitutional revolution, what did they want? We know, we always talk about it, House of Justice, but what does that really mean? In a way, I studied the process of self-determination I call it Republican nationalism throughout the past century in Iran. So those demands for each movement were, of course, different. Their articulations are sometimes different than the way they actually, the structures they actually plan on altering. So, for example, when we're talking about that House of Justice during the Constitutional Revolution, which is a well-known demand. What is it? What kind of structures are we really talking about? What kind of social structures? What is the real demand? What I've noticed, one of the recurring themes was citizenship. So in my opinion, the Constitutional Revolution tries or attempts at, in terms of, and that's how it starts, to build a modern nation states. That's where it starts. Modern nation states, what do they need? They need modern citizens. Up to that point, we had subjects of the realm, not really citizens with rights and responsibilities at the same time. So the Constitutional Revolution, however, fails to grant full citizenship to all the citizens of the realm. For one, we know women were not enfranchised, and even not all men were enfranchised. The criminals were not franchised. Many of the ethnic minorities were not. The religious minorities were not enfranchised, and if they were, oftentimes they were not able to fully exercise their rights. So this trend continues to the '79 revolution. So one of this is not the only one, but because we only have a certain amount of time, this is the one subject that I really like to talk about, the failure to develop modern citizens with rights and responsibilities. In many ways, I think us as Iranian people, we're still not citizens. Many of us are subjects. It's just simply by observing the conduct of the current regime, you can tell we are not citizens. Things are done to us, not with us or for us. That's a lengthy discussion. So once I gathered all the data, who all the actors were, kind of summarized everything, what the demands were, I was able to develop a causal loop model, kind of a diagram that would show those interactions. And if you guys are kind enough to, I don't know if you can read, you probably can't. I can't read it from here, but it's showing the five constellations of forces that were in the past century interacting with each other. And some of them are more, they have more emancipatory potential. Some of them are more repressive. And so they interact with each other that way. 2 years of work, ladies and gentlemen, that's the diagram. So I know I don't have a lot of time, but I'll say this. I spent a lot of time chasing the data. And I think that is very telling. especially on women, involvement of women and ethnics, which I call minoritized ethnics after lengthy discussions with Dr. Mateen. I was very uncomfortable with ethnic minorities because they're really not minorities. 49% of the population can't really be a minority. I discussed that at length. What else? So the data, I have to wonder in terms of my future research, what would happen, what would I have, how better I could have developed this if I had more data, if I had all those missing links, if I, for example, knew, if I had more understanding, a better understanding of what the women's involvement in the coup and in the nationalization was, because I can draw one conclusion. In the aftermath of the coup, we have the white revolution, and one of the first proceeds of that revolution is enfranchising women. And we were just talking about that Shah did that, engaged in that process in hopes of preventing a revolution. So I have to wonder if women's enfranchisement wasn't, gender equality demands wasn't well and alive in the society. It's just not reflected as much as I would like to see in our scholarship, or it's not reflected in our data. And same goes for the ethnic issues. So basically, what I'm trying to present to you is a macro overall image of the both domestic and international forces that have been in play over the past century to form modern Iran, to produce a country to where it is right now. Because in my opinion, this process of Republican nationalism and democratization was always frustrated by both domestic authoritarian forces as well as the empire. And I'll end it there.
Thank you very much. Let me to use the privilege of chairing the panel and ask two questions or comments, give a comment to your presentation. The first one goes into you, Farhad, is, I read your abstract and understand your argument of distinguishing between three different periods. You use the movement, social movement for the Islamic Revolution, what happened, ended with the Islamic Revolution of 79. This I understand. Then you go to the Green Movement, 2009. Again, if you follow this definition of social movement, organized effort of a large number of people, yes, that is a social movement in 2009. But when it comes to 2016, you adapt a term, non-movement. And my question is that what makes you to avoid to use the term of crowd, jama'at? Because, this is, for me, goes beyond terminology and language term. It's more than that. Crowd. Why you don't use crowd? When I was reading your abstract, I went to all my papers and I realized that I defined in my work crowd as a literally large hoshdar dehande, large number of people in close proximity to each other, localized collectiveness. So if we go to that, then you might come to another definition of crowd, of what the people came to the street in 2016. You can call it casual crowds, you can call it conventional crowds, but they are crowds. And we have crowd in Iranian history, contemporary history, modern history. What makes you to avoid the term crowd and instead using non-movement? And this is my first question. After you finish, then I move to Maral. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very pertinent question. If we look at the history of the notion of crowd, Le Bon, and then the crowd in history, and many in the German society, crowd is, in a way, not structured enough. The movement 2016, 2018, 19 is, from my viewpoint, more structured than a crowd and less structured than a social movement. It's in between. So, because there is a kind of, I would say, thin social movement thread in it. It's not enough for me to call it a social movement, but it's more than a crowd, from my viewpoint. Crowd is not structured in terms of, I would say, explicit ideology, in terms of opposition to the power that be, and in terms of having a kind of homogeneity which goes beyond its, I would say, conjunctural dimension. So, in my view, the third movement is between crowd and social movement. More than a crowd, less than a social movement. Now, we can discuss it further once the research on this period is more structured, more consequential, and then discuss whether it is a crowd or is a social non-movement, which as I call it. My guess is that it is more than a crowd and less than a social movement. But it can be discussed. I'm not at all, convinced that this viewpoint is my definitive point of view. In 10 years' time, once there are many other researchers on this topic, particularly on this period, I might change my view and say it was a crowd. But I might change it more radically as well, I don't know, and say, no, it was more than a social non-movement. It was it was closer to the social movement.
I'm sure that, that, what makes you, I understand now, what makes you avoid using the term of crowd, because you identify it with more Le Bon.
Le Bon and the guy who got the Nobel Prize for Literature, I've forgotten his name, who wrote in German. Canetti. Elias Canetti.
But we have other version of the crowds in British history, in French history. And then I think, if you just, this is a debate. Okay, I'm very grateful to your comment. Something, to Maral, is when I was using, your abstract, you didn't touch on your abstract, because I was thinking, you're talking about your abstract. You mentioned one of the criteria of the movement in, let's say, post-Islamic revolution in Iran is that, you try, to give it some characteristics, to try, to see that, what makes these people coming together, what is their demands, and what they say. And then you just touch on some political issues. And one, if I remember correctly from your abstract, you say something about republicanism.
Yes.
Yes, this is something for me is there's ambiguity here. What type of republicanism do you think, I mean, this social movement in the Green movement or post-Green movement, they carry?
I actually talk about it since prior to that. What I categorized, in my understanding, the process that began with the constitutional revolution, and I think I kind of touched on it right now, is a process of Republican nationalism. So Republican in a sense that it's demanding democracy, and I traced all those demands throughout the data: democracy, self-determination, sovereignty, and that's where the nationalism, building a nation state actually comes in, and rule of law, citizenship, all these, and I've kind of mentioned them, though sometimes with a different terminology in the diagram, that it's overall this evolutionary process in the past century. It's a process of Republican nationalism in that these people are trying to come to some sort of self-determination, to some sort of rights as citizens, as full citizens, because right now, even our fullest citizens are not full citizens, in my opinion. And there are many other groups that constantly have to prove their citizenship in a way.
Something, I mean, puzzling me, if you go, I mean, for example, to the Iranian, the 1979 Islamic Revolution, prior to that, I mean, if you go a year before that, I mean, the call for the Islamic Republic was adapted later. It was not, I mean, if you go, I mean, to the literature and the protest literature, opposition was calling for the back to the constitutional codes. اجرای قانون اساسی مشروطه. That was that, I mean. This is something puzzling me, that, I mean, jumping from the constitutionalism to republicanism. If you say that, I mean, okay, that is the post-revolution, you are referring to the post-revolution, I understand. But, I mean, prior to the revolution, the call was not, I mean, for the republic. The call was the application or implementation of the constitutional code.
I understand. And like I said, it's not necessarily similar to the 79 revolution when they were asking there for an actual republic, though, as I'm sure you know, as a historian, there were throughout, you know, the previous years, there were calls at times for republicanism, but I'm not talking about direct calls or articulations of republicanism. I'm talking about items. I'm talking about the constituent characteristics of a republic. And it could come out in different forms. So when people are asking for self-determination, that to me is an element of republicanism. And that's one of the demands of the constitutional revolution. Citizenship, that's another element. So that's what I mean, not that it was, you know, from day one.
Great, thank you. If there is a question, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask a question from Professor Khosrokhavar. First of all, thank you for your interesting lecture. You defined social non-movement, and you referred to what we have as of, let's say, 2016 till now. And you mentioned also something about some slogans that we heard, specifically on the Reza Shah who had shot and that one. Tomorrow I will have a lecture here on the kind of public opinions, Iranian public opinions. I try to somehow disclose why people say that and who says that and these slogans and what they mean, because you know there are a lot of, in fact, misunderstanding. For instance, I would show that those who recognize themselves as Republicans and not monarchies, 60% of them support the slogan of Reza Shah who had shot. And also 60% of those who recognize themselves as social democrat, let's say leftist, again they support this slogan. I want to say that it seems a kind of complicated, but this is another issue that I want to mention, that there are some slogans that we see repeatedly here in all these years after Green movement, that for instance like Reza Shahruhechad, the چه اشتباهی کردیم, we did the revolution, what mistake we done, and so the reformists, conservatives, the time is over, اصلاح طلب اصولگرا دیگه تمام. You know that there are, and also on the kind of also foreign efforts we hear that نغزن نه لبنان جانم فدای ایران, you know that these are all again and again heard. So I want to say that it seems that there are some slogans there which are all these non-movements, as you said, they somehow repeat that one. And also there is a kind of also something we see that the purpose of those protests are against somehow regime change protests. So I consider there is something there that we can see it organized, although there is no leaders in a way. But I wonder that social scientists normally consider Wall Street movement as a social movement. At least we teach it to students when we want to say examples of social movements. We said Wall Street movement. What is the difference between what we had in Iran and something like Wall Street movement, that we can call them social movement, but this is social non-movement? Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very, very, very pertinent question. And as I told you, my view on the scattered movements between 2016 and 2018-19 is not totally fixed. Depends on the future research on that topic. But what I believe to be somehow factually defended or defensible is that first, they did not have intellectuals, and that's very important, and the lack of horizon of hope. That means all those slogans are either nostalgic of a kind of mythological past or mythified past, or point to a kind of desperate present situation. There's no future in it. Unless we believe that the call for a kind of Reza Shah is a future. But from my viewpoint, it is somehow a nostalgic view of a mythified past. If the future research shows that these two elements, lack of hope, lack of horizon of hope, and lack of intellectuals, are not valid assumptions, I put into question what I proposed. But if it is somehow accepted, I would say it was more than a crowd, because they had some, I would say, arguments of social movements. At least they knew to whom they opposed their view, opposed to the corrupt regime. From their viewpoint, they opposed to the religious despotism in Iran. They opposed themselves to it, and they put into question what might be called a theocratic regime. In that respect, I would say negatively, as a protest movement, they had some kind of semi or quasi-coherence, and that's why I call it social non-movement. The word non is not a good word, quasi-movement or whatever you like, but I try to distinguish it from social movements and from total non-movements. I fully agree that the notion of social non-movement, the word, the expression is perhaps not adequate. Thank you very much.